Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Kyle Tran Myhre. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, I'm joined by Minneapolis-based poet and activist Kyle Tran Myhre to discuss his article, How Artists Can Help Get ICE Out of Minneapolis and Everywhere. We just republished the article from Racket, a Minnesota-based journalist-owned outlet. He'll also talk with us about what response he's seeing in his community as they organize against this month's massive escalations by ICE in the city. But first, of course, these headlines. Remember how TikTok was supposed to be banned for being some kind of threat to national security since its Chinese owners might access your data? Well, after nearly a year of negotiations, a deal has been struck to build a new US version with ownership stakes divided amongst a handful of mostly Trump loyalist investors. This includes Oracle and MGX, which are each taking a 15% stake. Oracle is, of course, the tech giant owned by the Ellison family, who are the same folks who are working to acquire Warner Brothers. Meanwhile, MGX is a 2-year-old Emirate investment firm which, quote, aims to become a vehicle for AI-driven investments. So, do you feel more secure? 3 organizers who led a direct action at City's Church in St. Paul were arrested by the FBI on Thursday. Nikema Levy-Armstrong, Chantel Allen, and William Kelly helped organize a protest last Sunday, interrupting services at the church due to one of the church's pastors currently serving as the acting field director for ICE in Minnesota. Calling out hypocrisy among the supposed servants of God is a time-honored tradition. It was kind of Jesus' whole thing. But that didn't stop Pam Bondi in the White House from gloating over these arrests, framing the protest as the actions of, quote, far-left extremists who are impinging upon worshippers' rights to freedom of religion. Far from being anti-Christian, everything we know about Armstrong and Allen point to the fact that they're motivated to do their work for justice by their Christian faith. The White House also posted a photo of Armstrong, altered using Google AI tools, to depict her sobbing as she was taken away in handcuffs, darkening her skin and generally making her look, well, different from the self-assured, dignified person that we see in the original image. They eventually admitted to the fact that the photo was doctored, which is a little embarrassing. But it kind of doesn't matter. The work that they're doing to fracture our shared reality only needs the altered photo to be posted in the first place. The spin they're putting on this story either works for you or it doesn't, and that divide is something we really need to be thinking about in our organizing. This is going to be a story to watch. Bondi's agenda has always been about repressing protests and dissent, and this is a high-profile case where that agenda is being carried out against local organizers in a much more public way than ever before.
Hey everybody, this is Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. I read and give to Convergence because it has become a home for me to engage in critical analysis, find practical advice for organizing and strategy, and inspiration in the belief that a better world is not only possible, we can build it.
To make either a one-time donation or become a sustaining member, visit convergencemag.com/donate. You can find a direct link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
Last week, Minneapolis-based poet and activist Kyle Tran Myhre hosted a virtual workshop called What Can Artists Do? What Are We Doing? In light of the massive ICE and CBP surge in his city. His expectation was that a few dozen people might attend. Instead, over 500 people showed up to discuss and wrestle with the ways that artists can engage and show up to help get ICE out of Minneapolis and beyond. His follow-up article is now cross-published by us and the Minneapolis-based publication Racket. It explores how artists can use their time, energy, and resources to support local resistance to ICE operations. I'm joined by Kyle now to discuss that experience as well as what he's seeing on the ground in his community as ICE continues to aggressively disrupt and terrorize communities across Minnesota. Kyle, I know that we are recording this on Friday, which is the day of the statewide general strike. So we really appreciate you making some time to join us to talk about this.
Yeah, definitely appreciate the opportunity to share some of what I'm seeing here.
And that said, we're right in the middle of your day today. I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you've been seeing on the ground and your perspective on the general strike as a Minneapolis resident. How's things going?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very, very, very long couple of weeks here. And of course, the organizing has been going on far beyond that as well. But just in the very acute crisis moment of the last few weeks, I think today is an incredible example of something that, people who come from movement and who come from organizing know this, but I think a lot of people aren't aware of the many different layers of tactics that are happening. So there is a big march downtown today, in an hour or so from when we're speaking, and people are gonna gather there. I mean, thousands of people. It's going to be huge because our big actions are usually really big. But then, of course, there was also today something that was not necessarily publicly announced, but a huge action at the airport where clergy came in from all over, to just be present and pray and chant, and like a bunch of them are getting arrested kind of as we speak. And like, that was incredible to see. And then, of course, as many people are aware of, like, most of the actual like work that is happening is very, very hyper local, neighborhood based signal groups. Like, just being out last night, I won't give details about where I'm at, but like, I live in Minneapolis, and we have a little patrol route where we go and watch our middle school during like student drop off time and pickup times. And last night the wind chill was like 23 below, right? And we're just standing on the corner making sure that kids aren't getting snatched. And like, I think the metaphor there, I don't want to ramble too much, but it connects to what we're going to talk about. I think the metaphor is like, I don't know if I've ever been that cold being out for that amount of time, just standing there in 23 below weather. But I've also never been that kind of like bundled up, like where you have two hoodies on and a nice jacket, and like I'm wearing snow pants like I was a little kid going sledding, and like, and at the end of the day, it kind of evens out, and it feels like we can do this, right? And like, there's a metaphor there, right? That like, it's really, really bad in Minneapolis and in Minnesota right now, but people are layering up and they're continuing to show up.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, it's been interesting as the host of this show, watching the sort of like way in which ICE and CBP has been like rolling through different cities, changing their tactics, intensifying things, but also the way that our movements are learning from each other, responding to the moment, and really showing up in the way that like our neighbors and our friends and our comrades need us right now. And so,
can I actually shout out just very briefly, like, this was months ago now. I don't know if it was in October, but we took the whistle zines from Chicago, from the Pilsen Arts and Community House, and adapted them to Minnesota, or specifically to the Twin Cities, knowing what was coming. And so we took their zine that they already had, moved a couple of things around, added a page of like specific Twin Cities resources. And for a long time, that was the thing that was getting people to get into whistles as a tactic.
Yeah.
And it just shows that like, we're learning from Chicago. I know that whatever happens next, they'll take some lessons from here, but then they'll adapt their own hyper-local ways of doing things too. And that's been really, really, really inspiring to see.
Yeah. Sometimes when you take this 10,000 foot view, it can be easy to forget that like we are adaptable. Like we are constantly learning from each other. And that's what we're trying to do here at Convergence, right? Like help folks do some of that learning in more explicit and quick ways. Well, let's talk a little bit about this virtual workshop. Where did you come up with this idea, and why do you think you got such a like overwhelming response to it?
Yeah, well, I think two key points. The first is that like, we wanted to have a space for artists to strategize with each other, not because artists are special or more effective or have more potential than any other group, but because like, it's important for every discipline to think about what is the thing that you have to offer. If you're a healthcare worker, if you're a union organizer, like whatever sphere of influence we have, like to make a little space. And so like, I'm in community with artists, mostly poets, musicians, performance artists, but also visual artists, all kinds of artists. And I was like, let's just have some space to brainstorm a little bit. And our idea was, maybe it'd be a few people, locals, just kind of brainstorming project ideas together.
Sure.
And then, a million people sign up for it, which is great. But then the other reason we wanted to have this space was that I think the conversation about art and activism is very, very, very often focused on the intangibles, right? The idea of art as a space of hope and inspiration and imagination, and so this like magical thing of expressing yourself. And on one hand, I want to like validate that, like that is one of the functions of art. It's really, really important. And on the other hand, I think because that conversation takes up so much space, we don't always kind of come down to earth. And this workshop was about what are practical, concrete ways that artists can use not just our art to contribute to movement work, but the audiences we have access to, the space and the skills that we have access to, and these really, really kind of material concerns, which again, not more or less important than the deep spiritual stuff, but worth talking about, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting too, because I also feel like sometimes when I'm in space with artists who are connected to movements, there is this tension also about like, as artists, we're not just here to make your protest signs. Like we have also strategic contributions to make, which I feel like is that sort of like middle layer in between the sort of like, let's open up some visionary space and like, let's drop in at the 11th hour to make some protest signs or take pictures of the rally or whatever, that there's actually like a lot more meat that artists and artist communities can provide as part of the fabric of movements, that I think is such an important insight in this work that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that was, of our list of kind of major points we covered, that was maybe one of the, I think it was like the third one. It was the idea of using artists' skills in movement spaces. And that can be something, again, thinking really, really down to earth. If you know how to run a sound system, you can volunteer your expertise at the mixer to help the action be successful, right? Or like if you're a DJ. I think one of my favorite examples of this is hosting, whether that's an action or a virtual event or a town hall or a community forum, but like hosting is a really difficult and complicated skill. And I find that most of the people I know in my life who are good at it come from arts communities. Not exclusively, but it's one of those things you learn when you're hosting an open mic or a poetry slam or a 4-bill act at a bar, like how to engage the audience and have them like you, but also not get in the way and like move the event along. Like those are skills that I think artists can offer a lot of movement spaces.
Yeah, no, as you're describing that, I'm like, I can think of so many rallies I've been to where the program needed an MC who really understands crowd work, basically, right? Like,
well, it gets to what you said a moment ago too, about not just coming at the end to like be the host, but like artists often know how to structure events so that a 2 or 3 hour thing has an arc of experience. It isn't just speaker, 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 poem, speaker, speaker, poem, but like there's more movement in it. And I think, bring in artists early in your planning, not just at the end. That's another good takeaway.
It's a very good takeaway. Well, speaking of some of the highlights that you summed up in the article that you wrote, let's talk about some of these sort of key takeaways. And I'm also curious if there are things in there that like you were like, this is like a new way of explaining this, or a new insight that I think is really important for people to think about.
Yeah. So again, the idea of keeping things practical and down to earth. I think we started with talking about like fundraisers. That's probably the most straightforward example of how artists can kind of concretely, materially support movement work. It's like throw a fundraiser show or like auction off your visual art and donate the proceeds to a thing. And it's not the most fun or exciting thing to talk about, partly because not all artists like to talk about money, and partly because it isn't like being at the front of the action, saying my poem in front of 10,000 people. It's like, how can we move resources around? I love that. I also think, again, in the spirit of like just being really down to earth and practical, I think a lot about the physical space of the merchandise table. If you're in a band and after your show, people come up to your merch table and they buy your vinyl or your t-shirt or whatever, like that is a physical space that can be used to support movement work. So maybe that's you invite a local organizer to have flyers to hand out or to have their email list there, or ways to bring people into the work who are not already into the work. And just backing up a little bit, I think that was one of the bigger takeaways of the event, is the idea that artists have access to audiences who are often not already plugged in to movement. And like organizers need access to those people to bring more people into the work. And I think, if you're a semi-successful MC or a semi-successful band or poet and you tour and you're going, like, just use Minnesota as an example. You're not just playing in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but you're touring to Brainerd and St. Cloud and Duluth and Rochester and Marshall and like all around the state. Like that is a space of possibility. That is a space of activating more and more people to know what's going on and to find their way into what's going on.
Yeah. Well, it also occurs to me that like I know a lot of people, and speaking for myself is that like I got into both movement, like social movements and music because I was looking to be with people and like find a place to be where I didn't feel like a total alien. Right? That like that is at the end of the day like why I picked up a bass guitar and started a band as a high schooler, right? That like being with my best friend and making music together, even when it was just like we were just covering songs we liked because we were learning our instruments and figuring out how to play together, that like so much of being an artist is just about being together. And the like importance I feel like in this time of figuring out ways to be together that like ease some of the agony that I think a lot of us are in feels really critical and like it's inviting as opposed to judgmental, right? That like I think there are ways that our political spaces can feel very exclusive and judgmental, but that using art, using music as a way of welcoming people, there's like hospitableness to it that I feel like is really important in what you're saying.
And that it's actually, I mean, I think the last takeaway on our list of things we talked about at the event was just the notion of, in quotes, people doing stuff, right? And how much, again, going back to the idea of that there's a both and, right? There's a both and in terms of, on one level, being in a space with community and kind of just, being able to meet people and have fun and like experience a little bit of joy and relief, like that matters. That is actually really
Yeah.
important, particularly in a climate in which they are trying explicitly to exhaust us and like take our hope away and make us feel bad. And so like that's important. And I think also, again, that idea of if you have that one flyer for the next action, or you have a zine about an issue that is going on in your community, and like those little moments become people's doorways into a life potentially of doing the work. How are we inviting people in? And it is often through, again, not to get too poetry nerd about it, but like it isn't just that like I believe in justice and I'm against fascism. Like these are just big words and concepts. It's about the specific. You zoom in on the specific invitation that someone at some point in my life gave me to come to the meeting or to come to the action and meet the person. And it's the idea that like do the thing and that opens up doors to do the next thing, whether that is an arts thing or an activist thing or some combination of them. But like you show up to the thing and that opens pathways into being more involved.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that resonates with me for sure. Well, one of the other things I'm curious about is also like, are there things that you're seeing in the like Twin Cities artist community in particular that sort of stand out to you as like good examples of this? Like how are people showing up for each other? Basically in every bullet point, you have some examples, which I think is really cool. You're like lifting up other folks from the scene. But are there examples of work that folks are doing, even in connection to this week of action that you want to shout out for our audience?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the hardest things about doing this whole kind of project, the event, and then the after event kind of report back stuff was just, there are so many good examples. And in the article, if you read the article at Convergence Mag, I kind of share like one example to illustrate each point that I'm making. But in the actual workshop, and you can find the notes and all the slides are publicly available, there are many, many more examples. And even in this conversation, like, so I mentioned that I come from poetry and music mostly. And so that's kind of the community that I'm most in touch with. But I really think leaders right now in the Twin Cities are visual artists, like visual artists doing incredible, like deep narrative intervention work through very simple, like one-page designs. That's been really, really cool to see. Both on the narrative level, putting them up around town, letting people know that there is a widespread, and there is kind of anti-ICE attitude, but then also on that more concrete level, like using visual art as a way to raise funds or to convene space. People come together for a screen printing workshop or a poster making event at the local coffee shop, which just happened a couple days ago here in my neighborhood. And that's been really, really cool to see. I also can shout out a kind of newer formation in Minnesota. Is called Twin Cities United Performers. And I think they originally came together to talk about like, if you're in a band, you're playing gigs, like making sure that communication on just like a labor level, that communication with the venue is good, that the compensation is what it's supposed to be, that kind of stuff. But because then there's this core of kind of activated musicians, that then itself is a powerful thing. And so when something happens like what's happening right now, like Teacup, Twin Cities United Performers, can be called into action. And so like on one hand, yeah, they've organized a huge fundraiser coming up at First Ave, the historic First Ave venue, in a couple of weeks, and that's going to raise a ton of money. They've also put out a call for Minnesota-based protest art. And how many times have we heard that conversation about how like, oh, there's no protest music anymore, which like makes me want to tear my hair out. But
there's so much.
but like Teacup again has kind of put walk the walk on that and said like, share your Minnesota-based protest art, tag us in it on social media, and like we'll share it out. And so now there's this huge database of local musicians, stuff that people are writing in the last week, the last 2 weeks. And of course, my own work, like documenting poets, a bunch of really amazing poets, spoken word poets, slam poets have been creating really, really, really good work about what is happening right now. The idea that our inspiration doesn't just have to come from 50 years ago, even though it should. Like that stuff is beautiful too. But there are people doing this work right now.
No, that's really awesome. And it's funny, like reading your article, it was amazing to me how many names I also recognize. I was like, right, I know Janata Petrus's work. I know Ricardo Levins Morales' work. There are so many people from the Twin Cities who are like, they're famous to me. And it also, as you're talking, it also made me think about, I don't know, at this point about 10 years ago, I had the good fortune of being in Minneapolis for May Day. And just like there is this huge through line, it feels to me, of like public art, of performance art, of just like people making weird stuff this is what I miss about the Midwest. I live in the Bay now, but this is what I miss about the Midwest is people are free in a different way. It's just be like, I'm gonna do weird stuff outside. It's great. I don't know. It was really exciting to me to be like, oh right, like it's not an accident that the Twin Cities is sort of the heart of this. Like maybe we can do a general strike, both from a like organizing perspective, like the things that like the like faith, labor, community organizing groups have been doing for decades now. But then also I'm like, oh, culturally, there's all this stuff going on. Some of it's old, some of it's new, and like there are people who are leading the way on this stuff, which is really cool. So.
And again, it's the kind of thing that makes sense intellectually, but then just being in it, and like I've lived here for 20 years, and knowing that when I moved here, I was benefiting from very specific work that people before me had done, not just like in general, like the work, but like, different things to move resources around for artists, or to create different things within the school and higher ed systems, et cetera, et cetera. But then like being here, living through, I don't know if people know this whole history, but like even pre-uprising, before the murder of George Floyd, there's abolitionist work happening here.
Yeah.
2016, 2017, and of course before that too. But like, and being able to see that work, which was very, at least in my experience with it, very narrative in general, like telling a different story about public safety and telling a different story about punishment and resources and budgets as moral documents, et cetera. And then that changing how people thought about the issues once we do get to 2020 and the murder of George Floyd and all the organizing that came out of that. And then now being here in 2026 and all the lessons people learned from that. Then of course from other police murders in 2014 and before too. So this is, everything is layered on top of everything else, both in terms of the organizing and the cultural work, like the cultural element of that organizing too. And yeah, I think that's why we're seeing, as terrible as things are here right now, it's also a very hopeful time. Like there's people doing unbelievable work here.
One of the things you write about also in the article is that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is actually just take our artist hats off and show up as neighbors. What has that been looking like for you? I mean, you mentioned at the top just like being part of a neighborhood patrol, but are there other things that you've been up to? And is also this something that came up in the workshop? Is it something that people were talking about and trying to navigate?
Yeah, I mean, well, because the workshop ended up being much, much bigger than we thought it was going to be, we kind of threw our pedagogical facilitator hats out the window a little bit, and it ended up being a little bit more of a presentation. But like the presentation part of it that was really important to me before we even talked about any of the arts related stuff was just like, what is the call to action right now? Or what are the calls to action right now? Because, again, for people listening to this, for your audience, like you might be in movement already, you kind of know what's going on, but a ton of people don't. A ton of people are just, posting Reddit comments like, what's going on? We need an international general strike. And like, I don't disagree with that. Like, I think that's
Yeah,
great.
it's not
but
wrong.
in terms of the actual organizing that is happening, listening to immigrant-led organizations who have been doing this work for years and years. And so, yeah, it's stuff like, right now, a lot of trainings, and the trainings have been harder to get into because they're so popular, but like
Sure.
taking a legal observer training, a kind of active bystander training, a know your rights training, different organizations have been offering those. And that for many people is a first step, because you take your upstander training, and then that might put you in touch with a hotline, or like when, that might be the first kind of iteration of a rapid response network. But then since then, all these very, very local kind of neighborhood to neighborhood, block to block rapid response networks through, Signal have popped up. And that's, the next point on that list is find it. And that can be easier said than done too, for people who aren't plugged in. But there are different ways to find those networks, whether talking to neighbors, or there are a couple of online resources people can tap into. But just to, be able to get those signal messages that like, oh, they're staging here, like let's have some people go check it out, that kind of thing. And then from there, the basic like mutual aid stuff, a ton of donations, a ton of, not just donating money and supplies, but like donating time, like giving rides to people, going to get groceries for people. And I think all that stuff is important, right? It isn't that one is more important than the others, but it's all happening, and it's all kind of supporting and building a scaffolding for the other actions that are happening too.
No, that makes good sense. And I also feel like it's like those of us who also have more flexible schedules during the day, like that's actually a huge resource too. Like I think about this a lot. It's a big deal that my partner works in education, and it's like, she has to be at school sites all day, every day. And it's different to have a schedule where it's like, I kind of decide what to do with my hours, and that makes it more possible for me to be a part of certain rapid response things, that kind of thing as well.
I mean, it relates to the conversation about artists too, right?
Yeah. Having a different schedule, a different rhythm of life is actually like, we need people who are moving in different rhythms.
Well, and then again, not to be movement nerd here, but like historically, like how students have been so central to mass protest movements, because students, obviously have a ton of responsibilities, but maybe have a more flexible schedule and can plug in different ways than a 9-to-5 parent can plug in. So
yeah, totally, absolutely. One of the thing that you conclude this article with that I think is very profound is this sort of reflection on the fact that one of the things that has been widely reported about Renee Good is that she was a poet, and that like there's kind of this divide between people who are like, yes, I see myself in that, and then people who are like, that's kind of cringe. I recently said to a friend of mine that to be cringe is to be free. But I also think like that's this sort of observation about the role of the artist in society and the way that ideologically we approach art is a really important one. I was just wondering if you talk to that a little bit, this relationship between art and freedom and fascism, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, so many people much smarter than me have written about like the aesthetics of fascism, et cetera, et cetera. And like, it's interesting to use a term like cringe, because like what is on an objective level more cringe than like, I'm going to accept someone else's Nobel Peace Prize, or what is more cringe than like JD Vance? Yeah, and giving an interview talking about all this stuff, but then and it's not just on the reactionary right, but also on the left too. The idea like poetry and like expressing yourself in that way is all woo woo or whatever, and like I think it's really, really important to claim that. I think it's really important for the left to claim culture. And art, and the fundamental importance of people expressing themselves, and the fundamental importance of people coming together in community to express themselves. Like I come from the world of spoken word poetry, and like, again, talk about stuff that is stereotyped as cringe, right? Like most people have a very negative view, but my experience with spoken word is that these are spaces in which people come together to tell their stories. And it isn't about the one person on stage who is a brilliant artist. It's about us in a space together telling our stories. And like, there is something revolutionary. And like, I hate to use that word even because there's so much baggage in it, but there's something really, really vital about that. And so going back to Renee Good's identity as a poet, I think the way that the article closes then is thinking about that in the context of how artists are as we know, historically targeted by ascendant fascist movements, right? Partly because artists like tell the truth, partly because artists are not easy to control by the traditional levers of power, aside from just murdering and disappearing people. And I think that same spirit of kind of rebellion that we see in an artist and in an arts scene, an arts community, is reflected kind of in, well, I live in Minneapolis. I'm going to use Minneapolis as my example, but we can talk about Minnesota more broadly, the whole kind of metro area. But, the same reason that they hate artists is the same reason they hate Minneapolis, because we're not just, rolling over for them. And I think going back to the idea of how important it is for a strong, progressive left in this country to really lean into arts and culture. Like, I think that's why we win, because we have people who tell the truth and are unafraid to kind of live in their truth and build with each other and tell these stories. I don't think we win without telling these stories.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite right. And like, I don't know, it's also not lost on me that like part of the second Trump administration's agenda is also sort of like dismantling a lot of like, even when we talk about very institutionalized culture, right? Whether it's like the Kennedy Center stuff, it's just like all that is not coincidental. It is a core piece of the sort of like the weird flex and the pageantry and the like the aesthetics, right? Of what it means to be an authoritarian. Are there other things from the workshop, from your article that we haven't talked about that you want to lift up?
Because the workshop ended up being bigger than we had planned, we still wanted to have some kind of interactivity. And so we used, again, for any of you out there who do virtual programming or virtual like activist stuff, like we used Padlets, which is just kind of an online like bulletin board where people can add basically a sticky note to a big board where you ask a critical question. And like, that way people could participate without us like having everyone unmute themselves and talk. But like that ended up being really, really cool. Like one of the questions we asked was like, what is a piece of art that right now is meaningful to you because of the world that we're in? Like what is giving you some fire or some inspiration? And then you can look, like these Padlets are still live. You can look at this board of like 100 responses of people sharing recommendations. We did one on like, what are cool kind of arts and culture driven projects in your community that you want to shout out? And so here's a huge list of these incredible projects. And then we also did one that was just a visionary question, like what could we see? Like what isn't necessarily happening but could happen? What is maybe a project you might think about taking on? And that's also been really cool to see. I think we all, whether we identify as artists or not, can benefit from spaces where we get to just vision a little bit and think about these broader questions of what could be in our communities. So that was really cool to see.
That's really cool. I mean, that also makes me think about this other piece, which is like, I think that we are also operating in an environment right now where discovery is really hard, right? The like way that social media operates, the fact that like, despite a lot of people's attempts to the contrary, the pandemic is still ongoing, right? Like there's a lot of sort of like structural challenges with technology, with changes in society, whatever, that do make discovery of important projects, art that speaks to us, harder. And I think that like one thing that I'm a little curious about and that I'm sort of like seeing in some of your responses is also the role that a social movement can play in surfacing some of this. That like there's ways in which the like algorithmically driven sort of like streaming only media environment that we're in, it's so like heavily governed by entities that may not have our best interest in mind. I don't know. It feels like there's something here too about like kind of resisting that like monoculture thing that is being fed to us. That seems really important.
We're in, I think, a fascinating moment right now where like, yes, because of algorithms and AI and the way that social media functions, like a lot of really, really cool stuff is kind of going under the radar. And like, if you're not part of a local music scene or a local kind of arts and culture scene, you might miss stuff. And so that, that's just a call for all of us to be more mindful of like sharing cool stuff when we find it, making, old fashioned, making mixtapes for our friends, right? Or like, however we end up doing that. But I also want to shout out on the flip side. I think a lot of monocultural stuff right now is really, really cool, right? Like, I think some of the most popular artists are also some of my favorite artists. Like I love Chappell Roan and Olivia Rodrigo. The best album of the last 10 years, maybe my favorite album of all time, is the Bad Bunny album that came out a year ago.
Yeah.
he's about to perform at the Super Bowl. And like, it is this unbelievably beautiful and like resonant and deep and very political album. And so if people aren't familiar with Bad Bunny, like this is the time to get familiar. And so like it's a complicated thing in that we have some really cool stuff happening at the very most visible places in culture, and then some really, really cool stuff happening at the kind of most invisible places in culture. And yeah, it's just a constant navigation of that. And like, what are we sharing? What are we supporting?
You make a really good point too, that there's like so many people in pop culture who are occupying these sort of like more politicized trickster kind of roles, like who are unwilling to be boxed in and yet still are making these hits. It's a weird moment in culture for sure.
And I mean, I hate to also shout out, because it's been shouted out to death, but like how good Andor was,
Yeah.
you know, as a Star Wars property, like, you know, and there's all kinds of baggage there in terms of Disney as a company and like, you know,
Sure.
all that. But like Andor, just its writing very explicitly revolutionary, right? Like there's not just in the subtext. Yeah. And there's, you know, other examples like that everywhere. And I think that's the thing, like culture happens and produces itself at multiple levels of visibility and invisibility, and like it can all be pushing the rock in the same direction, hopefully, if that's a metaphor that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, and at the very least is like opening up space for conversation too, that like can feel safer and just like more available than like talking about the world as it is, perhaps. Well, Kyle, this conversation has been awesome. Thank you so much for making the time to chat on this incredibly busy day and this incredibly busy week in this absurd year.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your contributions and taking the time, and stay well, stay warm. All solidarity to you guys out in the Twin Cities.
Likewise, thank you very much.
My thanks again to Kyle Tran Myhre for joining me. You can read Kyle's full piece, How Artists Can Help Get ICE Out of Minneapolis and Everywhere, on our site now. You'll find links to that and other ways to connect with his work in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstrom. Editorial assistance provided this week by Akin Allah, and Kimmy David designed our cover art. Convergence Magazine is a proud founding member of the Movement Media Alliance. If you've got something to say, please drop me a line. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to helping make sure that our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.